Vivian stood at the jet bridge, the air electric with tension as Daniel Mercer, CEO of the airline, entered, his presence instantly silencing the murmurs of passengers. Cassandra's face drained of color as realization dawned, her carefully crafted power crumbling. "Ms. Caldwell," Mercer said clearly, addressing the stunned cabin, "thank you for exposing a truth many ignore. Discrimination has no place here, or anywhere. Effective immediately, Cassandra Wells is terminated." Gasps filled the cabin. Richard Davenport sank into a seat, arrogance replaced by panic. Vivian turned slowly, confidently facing the passengers, her voice firm yet compassionate. "Thank you for watching. Remember, true power lies not in privilege, but in standing against injustice. If this story resonates, drop a 1 below. I genuinely want your thoughts. Don't forget to comment, subscribe, and share to help spread change." The air inside LAX International Airport was thick with the usual chaos. Boarding calls echoing overhead, the rhythmic hum of suitcase wheels rolling over polished floors, and the constant murmur of hurried conversations blending into the mechanical drone of the intercom. Travelers moved in a frantic rhythm, their faces either etched with stress or lost in the mindless routine of another flight. In the midst of it all, Vivian Caldwell strode to the terminal with calculated precision. She was an undeniable presence, poised, powerful, untouchable. Dressed in a sleek, tailored black pantsuit with sharp lines that cut through the air like authority itself. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that could only be earned through experience. Her leather handbag rested lightly in the crook of her arm, her heels clicking against the floor in a steady, measured rhythm. To most, she was a woman who belonged to a world of power, the kind that made decisions, shaped policies, and walked into boardrooms where others sought permission to enter. But Vivian Caldwell knew better. Power, real power, didn't come from what you wore or where you sat. It came from knowing how the game was played, and who had already decided you lost before you even stepped onto the field. It was in the way security guards eyed her just a second too long, their hands twitching near their radios as she passed. It was in the way store clerks ignored her in duty-free shops, choosing instead to cater to travelers who exuded the right kind of privilege. It was in the way her presence alone seemed to challenge the unwritten rules of spaces like this, places where her success was questioned before it was acknowledged. And now, as she reached the first-class boarding gate, she could already see the shift. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with sharp, tired eyes and a blonde bob that barely moved as she turned, barely glanced at the elderly white couple in front of Vivian before scanning their boarding passes with practiced, automatic smile. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. and Mrs. Monroe," she chirped, her voice warm and polite, almost effortless. The couple barely acknowledged her before shuffling forward, their eyes fixed ahead, secure in the certainty that this was their world. Then it was Vivian's turn. She handed over a boarding pass without a word, already anticipating the moment, the split second of hesitation that always followed. Sure enough, the agent's gaze flicked down at the ticket, then back up at Vivian. She hesitated. It was subtle, a fraction of a second, a flicker of something that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Vivian always noticed. Her name was printed clearly on the ticket. Vivian Caldwell, first class, seat 2B. She was supposed to be here. But for a moment, the agent seemed to be doing the math, mentally recalculating the equation that didn't add up in her head. A black woman, first class. Her practiced smile returned, but this time it was hollow, her professional warmth now thinly stretched over a silent question. "Welcome aboard, Miss Caldwell," she said finally, her voice clip controlled. Vivian nodded once, smoothly reclaiming her ticket and stepping forward. She didn't react. She never did, because acknowledging it would only feed their discomfort, and she had no intention of giving them the satisfaction. Instead, as she crossed to the glass doors leading to the jet bridge, she allowed herself the smallest, quietest smirk. Let them hesitate, let them wonder, because they had no idea who they were dealing with. And by the time this flight landed, they would never forget. Vivian stepped into the first-class cabin, and immediately the air shifted. It wasn't just in her head. She could feel it, a subtle but unmistakable ripple in the atmosphere, like the moment before a storm breaks. Conversation softened, Stolen glances lingered, and expressions flickered between curiosity and quiet disapproval. It was the same pattern, the same choreography, just a different stage. She didn't need to look around and know how it played out. She had walked into a world that had already decided she didn't belong. She moved towards seat 2B with unbothered grace, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. Yet as she set her bag down and adjusted her blazer, the weight of scrutiny pressed against her. She could feel it. Asterisk, asterisk, the deliberate act of being watched. Asterisk, asterisk. And then the first voice came. Asterisk. Didn't know they were letting just anyone into first class these days. Asterisk. Vivian didn't turn. She didn't need to. She already knew the tone, the cadence, the smugness disguised as casual observation. Richard Davenport, seat 3A. She had clocked him the second she walked in, mid-50s, salt and pepper hair slicked back, tailored navy suit that spoke of old money and entitlement. The kind of man who had never been told no in his life. The moment he saw her, his amusement was immediate, as if her presence alone was an inside joke he had just been letting on. Across from her, another man glanced up from a leather-bound journal. His auburn hair fell slightly over his forehead, his brown eyes sharp but unreadable. He was younger than Davenport, less polished but more observant. Ethan Hayes. He introduced himself, his voice polite but neutral. Vivian nodded once, fastening her seatbelt. She didn't need small talk. She already knew what came next. A moment later, Cassandra Wells appeared. Everything about her was rehearsed. Asterisk, asterisk, the poised stance, the perfectly applied lipstick, the effortless authority. Asterisk, asterisk. She had the kind of face that had mastered warmth on command, but knew exactly when to withhold it. The lead flight attendant. Vivian had seen her type before, the kind who thrived in exclusivity, who understood the delicate balance of hierarchy and made sure the right people stayed at the top. Cassandra began moving through the aisle, distributing menus with trained elegance. With some passengers, she added a little extra, an extra smile here, a light touch on the shoulder there. Personalized service designed to make them feel important. When she reached Vivian's row, she didn't stop. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just a smooth practice exclusion, like an artist brushing away an unwanted detail on a canvas. Vivian's gaze didn't waver, but she took note. A few rows ahead, Davenport let out a quiet chuckle. She didn't react, because she had learned long ago silence had a way of making people wonder if they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. Vivian kept her expression neutral, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest, but inside, a familiar fire smoldered. This wasn't new. She had spent years maneuvering through spaces like this, where invisible lines had already been drawn, and her presence was treated as a mistake. She had learned how to navigate their discomfort, how to exist without offering them the reaction they wanted. She knew the game, but this time, they had no idea who they were playing against. Cassandra moved on, her presence lingering just enough to reinforce the point of erasure. Vivian wasn't worth a second glance. The air around her felt thick with the unspoken, with a careful indifference that was more cutting than outright hostility. Across the aisle, Richard Davenport stretched lazily, the smirk never quite leaving his face. He was enjoying this, asterisk, asterisk, watching, waiting, entertained by the performance of exclusion. Asterisk, asterisk. Vivian exhaled slowly, steadying her breath. She had long learned that reacting only fed their satisfaction. They wanted her to fidget, to shrink, to prove that she felt out of place. Instead, she simply reached for her phone, scrolling through emails as if the scene around her didn't exist. But someone else was paying attention. Ethan Hayes, the journalist beside her, had been watching since she boarded. He hadn't joined in the silent mockery, hadn't ignored what was unfolding, but he also hadn't intervened. Instead, he had done something more deliberate. He had started taking notes. His pen moved lightly over the pages of his journal, his handwriting quick but controlled. He wasn't just observing, he was documenting. And that meant he wasn't just a bystander. Vivian stole a glance at him, noting the way his gaze flickered toward Cassandra as she worked her way down the aisle, her attentiveness reserved for select passengers. He tapped his fingers absently against the leather cover of his journal before murmuring, "You didn't get a menu earlier, did you?" Vivian didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. Ethan exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. Interesting. She could feel the shift now. Asterisk, asterisk, not in the way the crew moved around her, but in the way Ethan saw it all. Asterisk, asterisk, he was connecting the dots, his awareness settling into something that felt heavier than casual curiosity. Vivian didn't acknowledge it. Not yet, because she knew what was coming. The game had only just begun. Vivian sat perfectly still, her hands folded lightly in her lap, her posture effortless. Every movement around her was deliberate. Asterisk, asterisk, not hers, but theirs. Asterisk, asterisk, the subtle choreography of exclusion played out with meticulous precision. Cassandra moved to the cabin with the elegance of a seasoned professional, her every interaction tailored to make her first-class passengers feel valued, catered to, special. With some, she offered warm smiles and effortless familiarity, remembering names and favorite drinks. With others, she was professionally distant, yet never indifferent. But with Vivian, nothing. No menu, no drink service. Not even a cursory glance to acknowledge she was there. It was so precise, so intentional, that it was almost impressive. The first-class cabin moved in a quiet rhythm of exclusivity. Glasses clinked as wine was poured. Low laughter hung between conversations. The scent of freshly plated meals filled the air. Flight attendants moved seamlessly, their service performance of hierarchy and privilege. Vivian had seen this happen before, but never to her. That was the miscalculation. She wasn't just another woman forced to swallow indignities in silence. She wasn't a passenger who would let it go, who would later shake her head and tell herself it wasn't worth making a scene, because this wasn't about a meal. It wasn't about a drink, a menu, or a missing pleasantry. It was about power, and they had no idea how much of it she had. Across from her, Richard Davenport leaned back in his seat, swirling the deep red wine in his glass before taking a slow sip. His smirk was unmistakable. Asterisk, attention to detail really makes a difference, doesn't it? Asterisk, he mused, his voice low but pointed. Vivian lifted her gaze and met his eyes just for a second. She didn't blink, didn't react. Asterisk, asterisk. She simply picked up her fork and ate. Ethan Hayes, on the other hand, wasn't nearly as composed. Vivian could feel his attention shift, his tension barely masked as he watched the interaction unfold. He wasn't just taking notes anymore. He was waiting, watching, anticipating. Asterisk, asterisk. And the more Cassandra ignored Vivian, the more Ethan noticed. His fingers drummed lightly against the edge of his notebook. His eyes followed Cassandra's movements as she poured refills of champagne for the passengers around them, lingering when she leaned down to adjust a napkin of man in 1A, all while never once looking in Vivian's direction. Vivian recognized that tension in Ethan's expression. He wanted to say something. She could feel it in the way he kept shifting, in the way his grip tightened on his pen each time Cassandra brushed past their row. But he didn't. Not yet. And neither did Vivian, because silence had its own lethal precision. She had mastered it long ago. Richard Davenport leaned back in his seat, stretching lazily, a smug grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't just enjoying the show. Asterisk, asterisk, he was the audience and the critic, delighting in what he assumed was a shared understanding. Asterisk, asterisk, the flight attendants pointed indifference, the way the cabin seemed to subtly realign itself to make Vivian an outsider. Asterisk, asterisk, it amused him. Asterisk, asterisk. Didn't know they were letting just anyone into first class these days, he mused, his voice carrying just enough volume to be overheard, but still wrapped in a veneer of plausible deniability. Ethan Hayes stilled. His pen hovered for a fraction of a second before he carefully resumed writing, the controlled drag of ink against paper sharper than before. Vivian didn't move. She didn't glance at Richard, didn't acknowledge the bait. She simply reached for her water glass with deliberate slowness, taking a measured sip before setting it back down without a sound. Her restraint was surgical. She had learned a long time ago that words weren't always weapons. Sometimes silence was sharper. Richard, however, wasn't interested in subtlety. He was testing boundaries, pushing to see if she would flinch, if she would offer him the reaction he wanted, one that would validate his belief that she wasn't supposed to be here. When Vivian gave him nothing, his smirk widened. I mean, first class is supposed to have standards. Across the aisle, an older man chuckled under his breath. A woman 2 rows ahead stole a quick glance over her shoulder before turning away, lips pressed together in amusement. Ethan's fingers tightened around his pen. His grip was just shy of leaving an imprint on the leather-bound cover of his journal. Vivian still didn't react, because she knew what this was. Richard had spent his life being indulged. His arrogance wasn't just tolerated. It was reinforced, rewarded. Men like him were accustomed to the world adjusting to their comfort. They expected deference. And when they didn't get it, they doubled down. Sure enough, Richard let out a mock sigh, swirling his wine as if contemplating something deeply profound. You know, he continued, there's a certain atmosphere to first class. It's what we pay for after all. The flight attendant, Cassandra, reappeared at his side as if summoned. Of course, Mr. Davenport, she said smoothly, her voice laced with careful sympathy. Asterisk, we always strive to maintain the highest quality experience for our most valued guests. Asterisk, she didn't look at Vivian once. The moment was choreographed, precise in its delivery. Richard smiled, pleased. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath someone took when they were forcing themselves to hold something back. Vivian sat still, her pulse steady, her expression unreadable, because she knew something none of them did. The weight of exclusion settled deeper into the cabin, thick and undeniable. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. Cassandra moved through the aisle like a seasoned performer, her routine seamless, her service polished to an art. She leaned in when necessary, offered warm smiles where they were expected, and poured wine with just the right amount of flourish. Each tray she placed in front of the passengers was a picture of elegance: glistening silverware, perfectly portioned dishes, sauces drizzled with care, and bread rolls nestled beside crisp linen napkins. But when she reached Vivian, the rhythm shifted. There was no pause to confirm her choice, no question about dietary preferences. Instead, Cassandra wordlessly set down a tray, the clank of plastic against the table louder than it needed to be. Vivian looked down. The meal in front of her was an afterthought. The sauce was smeared unevenly across the plate, the vegetables limp and overcooked, the presentation carelessly assembled. Unlike the polished meal surrounding her, hers lacked refinement, precision, effort. The bread roll, present on every other tray, was missing. The oversight was so deliberate, it was almost theatrical. Richard took one look at her plate and let out a quiet chuckle. Well, he mused, swirling his wine lazily, some people should be grateful they're served at all. A few passengers exchanged glances. No one spoke up. Vivian picked up her fork and ate. She didn't hesitate, didn't pause to assess the damage or offer any sign that she had noticed. That was the real power move. Because while Richard and Cassandra had expected resistance, maybe even quiet outrage, what they had not expected, asterisk, what they had no idea how to handle, asterisk, was a refusal to react. Across from her, Ethan had stopped writing. His fingers pressed against the edges of his journal, the tension evident. He wasn't watching Cassandra anymore. He was watching Vivian, waiting, because something was coming. Vivian chewed slowly, deliberately. The food was terrible, not because of the dish itself, but because it had been made terrible for her. This wasn't about a meal. It never had been. This was about power, control, and the silent way people in privileged spaces policed who got to be comfortable and who didn't. Cassandra had executed her move with precision, expecting the moment to pass without consequence, another small act of dismissal that would never be addressed. She had no idea what she had just set in motion. Vivian took another bite, her expression unreadable, her posture perfectly composed. The storm was already forming, and before this flight was over, it would land directly on their heads. Ethan stopped writing. His pen hovered just above the paper, the ink still fresh from where he had been jotting down notes. But now his focus had sharpened. He wasn't just observing anymore. Asterisk, he was invested. Asterisk. He glanced at Vivian's plate. The missing bread roll, the way the sauce had been carelessly slathered across the food like an afterthought. He had seen how Cassandra's hands moved with trained precision when she served the other passengers, how each plate was placed with quiet elegance. But not this one. This one had been meant to send a message. Vivian, however, didn't seem fazed. She chewed methodically, her expression unreadable, her posture still poised. It was like watching a master chess player refusing to reveal her next move. Ethan leaned in slightly. "You didn't get a menu earlier, did you?" Vivian didn't react right away. She took another measured bite, chewed, swallowed, then finally lifted her gaze to meet his. No surprise. No irritation. Just silence. Asterisk, asterisk. That was enough of an answer. Ethan exhaled slowly, tapping his pen lightly against the cover of his journal. Thought so. Something shifted between them in that moment. Before, Vivian had been an island, isolated by Cassandra's careful neglect, surrounded by passengers who either didn't notice or didn't care. But now, someone had noticed, someone cared, and more importantly, asterisk, asterisk, someone was keeping track. Asterisk, asterisk. Ethan wasn't a loud man. He wasn't confrontational. But he was dangerous in a different way, because he knew the power of exposure. Vivian took another sip of water, her expression still impassive. But there was something different in her eyes now. Asterisk, asterisk, a flicker of quiet recognition. Asterisk, asterisk. She didn't need a hero, but she wasn't alone anymore. And that changed everything. Cassandra reappeared at the front of the first-class cabin, standing just past a curtain that separated it from the rest of the plane. Her posture was confident, polished, shoulders back, chin lifted, the poised stance of someone who knew how to command attention. She cleared her throat delicately, just loud enough for the murmur of conversation to die down. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice dripping with professionalism, "as we continue our service, we'd like to ensure that everyone is as comfortable as possible." Vivian already knew where this was going. Cassandra's eyes flickered past her, then over the rest of the cabin, carefully skimming over select passengers while lingering just a fraction longer on others. It was subtle, the way she let the sentence breathe, the way she let hang in the air just long enough for the meaning to take root. "If there's anything you need," she continued, "please don't hesitate to ask. First class is designed to be a truly exclusive and elevated experience for our most valued guests." A pause, a beat too long, a calculated choice of words. Vivian felt the shift immediately. A ripple moved through the cabin, passengers exchanging small, barely perceptible glances. Some turned to their seatmates, whispering behind raised hands, while others stole quick looks in her direction before pretending they hadn't. The weight of exclusion had been quiet before, discreet in its execution. Now, it was being put on display. The message was clear. Someone doesn't belong here. Vivian kept her expression neutral, but she felt the familiar tension coil deep in her stomach. This wasn't just about microaggressions anymore. This was an announcement, a statement. Asterisk, asterisk. Richard Davenport smirked, amused at the unspoken agreement forming around them. Ethan, on the other hand, had gone completely still. His fingers, which had been resting against his closed journal, tightened slightly. His posture didn't change, his expression didn't shift, but something about his presence in that moment felt different. Asterisk, asterisk sharper. Asterisk, asterisk. Cassandra smiled, the kind of expression that was meant to be pleasant but held an edge beneath it. She gave a small nod, then turned on her heel, disappearing toward the galley as if she had merely delivered a routine update. But the damage had already been done. The passengers had been granted permission to openly question her presence. And that was the moment when Vivian knew for certain. They were trying to erase her. But what they didn't realize was that she had already decided she wasn't going anywhere. Vivian sat still, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her water glass, her breath measured. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed. It was no longer just quiet exclusion. It was something heavier, something deliberate, as if an unspoken permission had been granted for everyone to question whether she belonged. She could feel it in the stolen glances, in the subtle way passengers whispered just low enough to feign plausible deniability. Then, from the corner of her eye, she noticed movement. A younger flight attendant, asterisk, asterisk, Natalie Brooks, if Vivian remembered correctly from the crew roster, asterisk, asterisk, hesitated at the front of the cabin, her fingers twitching slightly against the service cart. She was different from Cassandra, less polished, less sure of herself. Her uniform was immaculate, but her posture lacked the effortless confidence of someone who had fully learned the game of power. Vivian already knew what was coming before the girl even took her first hesitant step forward. Natalie approached carefully, as if weighing whether this was truly a necessary interaction. She stopped just beside Vivian's row, her grip tightening on the edge of the seat in front of her. "Miss," she started, then paused, glancing around as if searching for backup. Her voice was softer than Cassandra's, lacking the same edge of manufacturer authority. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Ethan set his pen down. Richard stopped swirling his wine. A passenger 2 rows ahead slowly turned her head, her lips parting slightly in expectation. Vivian let the question settle, allowed it to take up space, allowed the full weight of what had just been said to sink into the air around them. Then, slowly, deliberately, she turned her head and met Natalie's eyes. The flight attendant flinched. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Vivian said, her voice smooth, unwavering. Natalie blinked. There was no aggression in Vivian's tone, no irritation, no demand for an apology, just a truth so absolute that it sent a ripple through the cabin, as if the very walls of the plane had absorbed its weight. The young woman swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. Vivian didn't break eye contact. Natalie took an unsteady step back. "Of course, miss," she murmured, almost too quickly, before spinning on her heel and disappearing into the galley. Vivian slowly turned her gaze forward again, reclaiming her space. And just like that, the entire cabin knew. She wasn't going to shrink. She wasn't going to disappear. And anyone still questioning why she was here, they had just gotten their answer. The hush in the first-class cabin was different now. It wasn't just the usual luxury-induced quiet, the muted clinking of fine china and hushed conversations. It was unnatural, a silence weighted with discomfort, with the realization that something had shifted. Vivian inhaled slowly, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer. Every nerve in her body told her this was a moment, the precise second where power could be redefined, where the lines they had drawn around her could be obliterated. She rose smoothly from her seat. The movement was unremarkable, yet absolute. A few heads turned. Richard stilled, his grip tightening around his wine glass. Ethan's fingers twitched against the cover of his journal, but he didn't stop her. He wasn't sure what she was about to do, but he knew it would be worth watching. Vivian didn't rush. Control was in the pacing. She walked toward the galley with the same effortless confidence she had when she entered corporate boardrooms, when billion-dollar contracts hinged on her presence, when men like Richard realized far too late that she was the most powerful person in the room. Cassandra was there mid-sentence with another flight attendant, but her body stiffened when she noticed Vivian coming straight toward her. Vivian didn't acknowledge her, didn't even glance in her direction. Instead, she reached for the crew phone mounted on the wall and pressed the intercom button. A sharp chime rang through the cabin. The entire first-class section froze. Passengers paused mid-conversation, forks hovering over plates, hands tightening around glasses. Vivian lifted the receiver to her ear, her voice slicing cleanly through the cabin speakers. "This is Vivian Caldwell." Silence. Total, absolute silence. Cassandra's entire body went rigid. Richard's wine glass hovered midair. Ethan slowly leaned forward, his lips parting slightly, as if he just realized who he had been sitting beside this entire time. Vivian continued, her tone steady, each syllable landing like a slow, deliberate strike. "I'd like to personally thank the staff on this flight for providing a perfect first-hand example of the exact issue I spent the last year working to eliminate." A ripple of panic shot through the air. Passengers exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably, others suddenly regretting their complicity. Cassandra's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Richard set his wine glass down a little too hard, the liquid sloshing near the rim. Vivian wasn't finished. "For those of you unfamiliar with my position," she said, her voice calm, lethal, unshaken, "allow me to introduce myself properly." Cassandra swallowed, her face draining of color. Vivian let the pause stretch just long enough for everyone to feel it. "I am the Executive Director of Aviation Ethics and Inclusion," she said smoothly. *** senior consultant to the CEO of this airline. ***. Cassandra's breath hitched. Richard let out a low curse under his breath. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Vivian's lips barely curved at the edges. Not a smile, just a shadow of one. Because now they understood. And that was just the beginning. Cassandra stood frozen, her perfectly curated poise unraveling with each passing second. The precision-crafted world she had built in this cabin. The hierarchy, the exclusivity, the silent but razor-sharp exclusions, had just collapsed in front of her, and Vivian Caldwell was the one holding the wreckage in her hands. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Moments ago, there had been laughter, small, smug chuckles, the kind shared between those who believed themselves untouchable. Now, no one dared to breathe too loudly. Richard, who had spent most of the flight basking in his own self-importance, looked down at his wine glass, his smirk long gone. The woman 2 rows ahead, who had stolen quick glances at Vivian, now refused to lift her eyes. The man who had murmured an offhand joke earlier about standards in first class suddenly found the seatbelt sign very interesting. Cassandra tried to recover, blinking rapidly as she forced herself to speak. "Miss Caldwell," she started, her voice thinner now, stripped of its earlier condescension. I apologize if there was any misunderstanding." Vivian tilted her head slightly, a slow, unhurried movement. "A misunderstanding?" she echoed, her tone light, almost curious. That's an interesting word choice. Cassandra's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. The entire first-class section was watching now, but the roles had changed. Before, they had been spectators to an unspoken performance of exclusion. Now, they were watching something far more dangerous. The quiet dismantling of everything Cassandra thought she controlled. Cassandra's breath hitched, her practiced elegance cracking. "I meant, of course, we value all of our passengers." Vivian lifted a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. The authority in the gesture was effortless. Passengers shifted in their seats, watching as the very woman they had dismissed earlier took the reins of the entire room. Cassandra's eyes darted toward the front of the plane, as if searching for an escape, for someone who might intervene, but there was no one coming to save her. Vivian slowly, deliberately placed the phone back into its receiver. She turned slightly, scanning the cabin. Not hurried, not rushed, just letting the weight of her presence settle over everyone who had laughed, who had whispered, who had allowed this to happen. The humiliation that had been meant for her, it had never reached her. Instead, it had boomeranged back to the one who had orchestrated it. Cassandra's breath came faster now, her carefully manicured fingers clenching at the hem of her uniform. The realization was hitting her all at once. She had made a fatal mistake. And now, there was no undoing it. The plane descended smoothly, the cabin filling with the hushed murmurs of passengers preparing for arrival. But unlike the usual quiet rustle of belongings being gathered and seatbelts being adjusted, there was a different kind of tension now, one thick with anticipation, dread, and the uneasy realization that the flight was ending, but the consequences were just beginning. Vivian sat still, her posture composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She could feel the weight of the stairs, the way people were now hyper-aware of her presence. The shift was unmistakable. No one was laughing anymore. Richard had stopped smirking entirely. He had spent the remainder of the flight staring straight ahead, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against the armrest with a kind of restless agitation. He wasn't the type of man accustomed to being caught off guard, to being placed in a position where his usual arrogance didn't serve him. Cassandra, on the other hand, looked as if she could barely breathe. Her movements were jerky, her fingers gripping the hem of her uniform, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had spent the past hour avoiding eye contact, as if that might somehow make her invisible. It wouldn't, because just outside this plane, a storm was waiting. The moment the aircraft touched the ground, Vivian calmly reached for her bag, adjusting the strap as if this were just another day. But before the seatbelt sign even blinked off, passengers began to notice. Through the small windows, lined up near the jet bridge, a cluster of airport officials stood waiting. And at the center of it all, *** Daniel Mercer, ***, the CEO of the airline. His stance was rigid, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. His presence alone sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. A woman 2 rows ahead stiffened. Someone else sucked in a sharp breath. Even Richard, usually so self-assured, let out a quiet curse under his breath. They knew, whatever had happened on this flight, it wasn't staying here. The reality of their complicity had settled in. Cassandra's breathing grew uneven. She looked toward the exit, but there was nowhere to run, because the moment that door opened, judgment was waiting for her. The seatbelt sign blinked off, but no one moved. The usual rush of passengers eager to grab their bags and exit first never came. Instead, there was only stillness, a charged anticipation hanging in the air as eyes darted toward the front of the cabin where the real show was about to begin. The jet bridge connected. The doors hissed open, and Daniel Mercer stepped inside. The airline CEO was a tall man with a commanding presence, the kind of authority that required no effort, only a single glance to command absolute silence. His suit was crisp, his expression unreadable, but his gaze was already locked on one person. Cassandra visibly paled. Vivian didn't move, didn't need to. This wasn't her battle anymore. It was an execution. "Miss Wells," Mercer said, his voice deceptively calm, but there was no mistaking the finality beneath it. Cassandra's breath came in shallow gasps. "Sir, You're done." The words landed like a death sentence. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending not to watch while doing exactly that. Cassandra swallowed hard. I was only following." "No!" Mercer cut her off, his tone sharp, absolute. "You made a choice. Multiple choices. And now you'll answer for them." Her body locked up, her fingers clutching the fabric of her uniform, as if she could hold on to her job through sheer desperation. The official beside Mercer stepped forward, holding out a document. "Effective immediately," the official announced, "your employment with this airline is terminated." The cabin erupted in a collective intake of breath. Cassandra reached for the paper with shaking hands, but she barely seemed to see it. Her face had gone blank, her mind struggling to process the weight of what was happening. A small, panicked noise left her lips. "Sir, please," she whispered. "I've given 10 years to this airline. And in less than one flight, you destroyed your career." Cassandra's knees buckled slightly, but there was no mercy to be found. Mercer turned away from her, as if she no longer existed. His gaze now landed on Richard Davenport. Richard sat still, his fingers tightening around the armrest. He already knew what was coming, but his ego forced him to fight it. "Mr. Davenport," Mercer said, and this time there was a cold amusement beneath his words, as if he almost enjoyed delivering this particular blow. "You are hereby notified that your elite membership with this airline is permanently revoked." Richard's jaw clenched. "This is absurd," he hissed, but his voice lacked its usual arrogance. "Is it?" Mercer lifted a brow. "Because as of this morning, this flight has gone viral." Richard stiffened. "The entire country is watching," Mercer continued, crossing his arms. "Sponsors, investors, your name will be plastered on headlines by morning." He let that sink in before delivering the final blow. "And I imagine that won't look great on your board seat applications." Richard's face turned a deep shade of red. Cassandra let out a quiet, broken sound, because for the first time she understood. This wasn't just about a job lost. This was a reputation destroyed. And the worst part? They had done it to themselves. Ethan leaned back in his seat, the tension in his shoulders finally easing as he let out a quiet, amused breath. The first-class cabin was unrecognizably silent. The smug energy that had filled it just hours ago now replaced with an uneasy stillness. No one spoke. No one moved. No one wanted to be next. He turned his head toward Vivian, a slow grin spreading across his face. "I was going to write about this anyway," he murmured, voice laced with something between admiration and disbelief. "But watching it unfold in real time? Brutal." Vivian allowed herself the barest till of her lips. Not a smile, not quite, but something sharp, knowing, final. She reached for her handbag, adjusting the strap over her shoulder with a kind of effortless composure that made it seem as if this entire flight had been nothing more than an inconvenience. For her, maybe it had been. For Cassandra, for Richard, it had been a reckoning. The flight crew, those who hadn't participated but had chosen to stay silent, looked away as she passed. Their inaction had cost them too. They weren't the ones being fired on the spot, but they knew that when corporate came knocking, they wouldn't walk away unscathed. Vivian stepped to the cabin door, and the moment she did, the energy outside the plane changed. The terminal was buzzing. And then, the camera started flashing. A cluster of reporters stood at the gate, microphones raised, voices already firing off questions. Ms. Caldwell, can you confirm that this was a case of racial discrimination? What action will the airline be taking? Are you considering legal action? Vivian stopped, turned to face them fully. She wasn't the one who had sought this attention. But now, she owned it. She exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then, with measured control, she spoke, and the world listened. Daniel Mercer stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but his presence alone commanded attention. The reporters quieted slightly, sensing the weight of what was about to happen. He stood beside Vivian, his gaze scanning the crowd, then landing briefly on Cassandra, who still stood frozen near the plane's exit, her grip on her now useless employee badge tightening as if it could somehow anchor her. This airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind, Mercer stated, his voice steady, absolute, final. Effective immediately, an internal investigation will be launched to review not only today's incident, but the overall culture of our first-class service. Steps will be taken to ensure that what happened on this flight will never happen again. The murmurs of reporters intensified, cameras flashing, microphones pushed forward. Cassandra's face drained of all color. 2 uniformed security personnel approached her. Miss Wells, one of them said, professional but firm, you need to come with us. Her breath hitched audibly. No, she whispered, shaking her head as her body tensed. She turned to Mercer, desperation slipping into her voice. Sir, please, I made a mistake, but it wasn't. Stop, Mercer interrupted, his voice like a blade cutting clean through her excuses. You didn't make a mistake, Cassandra. You made a choice, over and over again. Cassandra's lips parted, her breath shuddering as her gaze darted around, searching for an ally, for someone who might step in. But there was no one. The passengers who had once laughed along with her now refused to meet her eyes. Even the crew who had silently gone along with her exclusion tactics stayed rooted to their spots, afraid to get involved. Please, she tried again, quieter this time, a note of true fear creeping into her voice. But no one answered. The security officers flanked her, stepping forward with finality. Cassandra's chest rose and fell in quick, panicked breaths. Then she was escorted to the terminal, past reporters, past cameras that captured the precise moment she lost everything. The ultimate disgrace. Vivian didn't turn to watch her go. She didn't need to. Instead, she shifted her attention to Richard. For the first time since the announcement of his revoked elite status, he looked smaller. His usual arrogance had drained from his features, replaced by something that looked dangerously close to shock. His fingers tapped absently against his arm, as if his mind was racing through a list of ways to fix this. But there was no fixing this. Mercer's gaze settled on him next. Mr. Davenport, he said, and the weight of the name landed harder than anything else in this moment. Richard exhaled sharply through his nose. I've already been informed, he said, voice clipped, controlled. Asterisk, asterisk, or at least trying to be. Asterisk, asterisk. Mercer didn't blink. Good. Then you understand that your behavior on this flight is now under formal review by our corporate partners. Something flickered behind Richard's eyes. His connections, his power, his influence. Asterisk, asterisk. None of it was going to save him now. For the first time in his life, Richard Davenport was truly accountable for something, and he had no idea how to handle it. Vivian turned toward the cameras, her expression calm but deliberate, her presence commanding without needing to demand attention. The flashes flickered across her face, reporters leaning forward, microphones extended, waiting, hungry for a statement, a reaction, something to define the moment. She let the silence settle first. Let them feel it. Let them absorb everything they had just witnessed. Then, with quiet precision, she spoke. "How many times," she asked, her voice smooth, unwavering, "has something like this happened without someone like me to expose it?" A ripple went through the crowd. The reporters exchanged quick glances, scribbling notes, their expressions shifting as the weight of her words landed, because that was the real story. Not that an executive had been humiliated, but that this kind of humiliation happened all the time. To people without a platform, without influence, without a voice that commanded an audience. Vivian held their gaze, scanning the crowd. The terminal, once filled with whispers and murmurs, was now unnaturally quiet, because everyone in that space, everyone watching at home, everyone who had ever witnessed or ignored discrimination firsthand, was now forced to ask themselves a question. How many times had they let it happen? Her hands were steady at her sides, her posture as composed as it had been the moment she walked onto the plane. This wasn't just about what had happened today. This was about what would happen next. She exhaled softly, the shadow of something unreadable flickering behind her eyes. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, and the world was left to reckon with itself. Vivian walked to the terminal, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her posture unwavering as the cameras followed her. The weight of the moment still hung thick in the air, the aftermath of what had unfolded lingering in the stunned silence of those left behind. The world was watching now, but this wasn't just about her. It never had been. She had exposed something much bigger than one flight attendant's abuse of power or one businessman's entitlement. She had pulled back the curtain on a reality too many people already knew. Too many had lived through. Too many had been forced to accept without recourse. The only difference was that this time, there had been consequences. This time, the guilty had been held accountable. This time, justice had been served. Not in anger, not in vengeance, but in absolute calculated certainty. But the question still remained. What if she hadn't been Vivian Caldwell? What if she had been someone without power, without influence, without a platform to expose the truth? What if this had been just another flight, just another quiet act of exclusion, just another humiliation suffered in silence? How many people have been erased, dismissed, humiliated? With no reckoning waiting at the gate. She stopped at the exit, turning one last time toward the cameras, her expression unreadable, her presence still commanding even as she stood at the threshold of the moment. What would you have done in my place? The question hung there, not as a challenge, not as an accusation, but as something heavier. An invitation. To reflect, to question, to decide. The screen fades to black. A final message appears in stark white letters against the darkness. Power isn't about the seat you occupy. It's about what you do with it. The screen remains black for a moment, the weight of the final message settling in. The silence isn't empty. It's charged, filled with a quiet realization that something far bigger than a single flight, a single act of discrimination, has just been laid bare. Then, softly, the words appear. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. The message isn't just about the story. It's about every story like it. Every moment of injustice that goes unseen, every person who has been made to feel small, every voice that was never given a chance to be heard. Together, we can create a world where everyone's dignity is recognized and respected. The words linger on the screen, a quiet but powerful call to action. Because change doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens when people decide that silence is no longer an option.